Welcome to For the Church, a podcast for the flock of Zion Presbyterian Church in Columbia, Tennessee. We want to help you think biblically about everyday matters. Zion Church exists to join Jesus in his mission to reach people with the gospel, and then to equip his people to worship and to serve. I'm your host, Keaton Paul, and joining me is my conversation partner and co-host, Seth Scruggs. Few things are more important to the Christian life than worship. In fact, worship in some capacity is why we get out of bed in the morning, really. Yet, we see that the Bible takes worship incredibly seriously. How we relate to God is vital for us to think through. But if you were to ask Christians how they related to God, we'd probably give vague answers about feelings and routines. Yet we all long to know God and be known by God more. In this season, we're going to explore Christian worship. Why worship? How should we worship? How have Christians worshiped throughout the ages? What does the Bible say about worship? And why do we do the things that we do? But before we get into that, hey Seth, how you doing?
I'm doing really good. We were just catching up before we started recording about our holiday break and the hiatus of the show and everything. It's been really good. I'm really excited to be back doing this. I've missed these hour-long conversations, and I'm really excited about this topic. You gave me a book recommendation to read before, as we kind of were prepping, which I'm sure will come up as we go through. And I've been reading that and really excited about everything that we're going to talk about, and just the direction that we're going this season. It's really good.
Yeah, I'm excited for it too. You know, I've spent a lot of time. We kind of landed on this being our next season 4 by my count, but that could be completely wrong. Just the current season that we're on. Back in September or October, it was pretty early on, and then I started kind of prepping for that back then, even. And have read a lot and revisited some old notes and even audited some classes along the way to get ready. And the more and more I've done kind of a deep dive on worship in the previous few months, the more I've really gotten excited to kind of talk through it and think through it to the place that, you know, our real kind of goal was to, you know, take a break during the holiday season. And so, you know, we finished up our previous series on the pastor back in November. And so I was like, you know, we'll take off December and, you know, I'll get caught up and finish reading in January, and then we'll be ready to launch in February. And here we are, the second or third week of January, and I've burned through all the books. And so Seth and I got coffee last week, and I was like, okay, well, here's kind of an outline of where we're going, when you want to start. And you were like, next week. I was like, cool.
I've really missed this, and I'm really excited about this topic. So it's I wanted to jump in as soon as possible.
Absolutely. So with that, let's jump in.
Yeah.
So the question like that we're asking specifically today, and we'll plunge every kind of facet that we can possibly think of, an angle concerning worship. But the question that we kind of want to ask today is why worship? And here's just a fact. We're all worshiping something. One of the books that I read was by Old Testament scholar Daniel Block. It's a big, thick book called For the Glory of God. He opens it up this way, the whole book, and it's 350 pages of like pretty dense biblical theology on worship. But this is the first line that he opens with. To be human is to worship. This statement is supported in the scriptures, declared in our creeds, and evident from history. To be human is to worship. And you know, this is something that I've told students before, and it really is a universal. You can just look around and see it. Everyone everywhere is always worshiping something. The real question is what? That's just a universal truth. But you can see it everywhere. And, marketing schemes, like, get it in our society, where, people see however many advertisements a day. um, Advertisers who are, just kind of doing their job, recognize the fact that everybody's worshiping. And so if you can get them to buy into a particular thing, you can sell them a product. Which again, like, intrinsically doesn't, it's not always a bad thing. Advertisements aren't necessarily bad, but it does play into a universal truth that we have, as humans, this certain longing, for a variety of things, and that we are worshiping beings. It's one of our unique facets to the rest of creation, that we worship in ways that the rest of creation doesn't. That I think is so vital for us to recognize, to even just start there, which is why worship is so important. Is that all of us are worshiping always.
Yeah. So the book that you recommended
Mhm.
is Rhythms of Grace by
Yeah.
Mike Cosper, who is probably best known for Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, but
Yeah.
also was a worship pastor in a church plant. And he describes and defines worship in a number of ways throughout the book. But one of the fundamental ways he describes it is ascribing worth. So
Hmm.
that idea that all you're doing when you're worshiping something is simply saying this is worthy of,
Hmm.
this is worth something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's interesting, and you may disagree with me on this. You may have something to say about this, but like the idea that like we worship in this sense, we've kind of like sanctified the word worship,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like to say what you're saying, we worship certain things and that's why advertising works. That isn't
Yeah.
necessarily a bad thing. That's how we're made.
Mm-hmm.
We are made to look at things and praise them and worship them in a sense of
Yeah.
we are ascribing worth to them. Now,
Mm-hmm.
there is obviously a prioritization of
Yeah.
worship that we're going to talk about,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but you might say you worship your kids
Mm.
because you're saying they're worth something.
Mm-hmm.
That's not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so saying that you worship, like you're saying, we're made for that. We're
Yeah.
made to look at things and appreciate them and ascribe worth to them.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a bad thing
Mm-hmm.
for that. Where it becomes a problem is when our priorities are messed up.
Yeah. Yeah. There it is.
And that's a huge thing. Is
Yeah.
it's like if you're worshiping your kids over and above everything else, if you're
Mm-hmm.
worshiping your own beauty over everything else,
Yeah.
or some person over everything else, that's when it becomes a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it is, again, who we were made for. We're made to ascribe worth. We're made to look at other things
Yeah.
and praise them.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And absolutely, that priority language is so key. Worship is and we'll get into some of the biblical mandates, but when we say worship, it actually comes from an old English word that, really boils down to just describing worth. But in the grand call for Scripture is this kind of this priority, of who we worship first and foremost. And so, just leading off with, the shorter catechism, and I put it everywhere. But what is our chief end? Our chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Which is, that's the call to ascribe the utmost worth to the Creator Himself. That language of glory, glorify and enjoy, are that's worshipful language. And so that that really is, priority wise, the first and foremost aspect of our love is to be to the Lord, loving Him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. But like you said, there's this other kind of vertical, or horizontal component of, we. I don't want to get carried away with worship too much, just for the sake of clarity, but loving others, and saying, yeah, there's beauty here, there's goodness here. Um, but what was I truly made for? I was truly made ultimately for the reverential love of God. And we just see this even in the creation account. There's this unique aspect that while the Lord is making creation and unfolding it before us, He makes us in His image, and so there's this creator creature distinction, but relation. Um, just built into the framework and the language of made in the image of God, uh, of just because of that, there's an innate covenantal relationship between the image bearers and God Himself, or the Creator, and humans, and that relationship is one where uh, everything we do should be in ascribing to Him worth and glory and majesty and worship. Um, and so one word that gets kind of thrown around has been thrown around recently in certain groups of um, theology nerds, uh, is the what's known as the beatific vision, which some people will look at and say that's a Catholic category. That's what the Catholics talk about, the beatific vision. But it's actually not true. That the Protestants and the Reformers um, had this concept of what were we made to do. We were made in some capacity to worship God, and the beatific vision is Jonathan Edwards calls it a happifying sight. It's something that only somebody that's a genius like Jonathan Edwards could say, and people not mock him. But kind of interpreting that is a Jonathan Edwards scholar named Kyle Strobel, one of my favorite guys. He's interestingly enough down at Biola. His dad is Lee Strobel, who wrote The Case for Christ and The Case for Everything Else. Um, this is my hot take for the day, but I think Kyle Strobel is way better than Lee Strobel. That's just my hot take. So do with that what you will. But I don't have a Twitter, so I don't have any other place to put my hot takes. But Strobel says this, kind of identifying this reality: the beatific vision is the sight of God revealed to God's people in eternity. It is the final end for which human persons were created. And so just when we think about worship, particularly, or in a more narrow sense, of our worship for God, what were we ultimately created for? We were created to behold the glory and the majesty of God, and to ascribe to Him the greatest worth. And so all of redemptive history, the whole story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, is the Lord's working in the Lord's story of how God restores us to Himself and for Himself, for our good and for all eternity. And you see this kind of most tellingly, interestingly enough, in the Aaronic benediction in Numbers chapter 6, which nobody really thinks of, but just hear this language thinking of beatific vision as the fact that we were made. God created us in order to reveal Himself to us, and that in that we are happy, to use Jonathan Edwards's term, or satisfied in beholding God. Aaronic benediction, number 6, 24 through 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. One of my favorite kind of current theologians of the day is a guy by the name of Mike Glodo, and he wrote a book. It's not really on worship, but I read it recently, kind of in preparation for this, on kind of the gospel in the Aaronic benediction. He says this: "We will see that God made us with faces, so that His could shine on ours, and that the Aaronic blessing could be to us not only a little Bible, but a little gospel." And that really is the whole of the Christian life, in every facet, as an ultimate. is driving to that reality, that God in his grace and his mercy would lift up his face upon ours. Though we, like Adam and Eve, hide our faces and worship the creation, what does the Lord do instead? The Lord pursues us, and he lifts up his face upon us, and he brings us peace by it. And that's truly what makes us happy, for us to glorify and enjoy him. And I think kind of having that framework of where are we headed ultimately, ultimately it's to see the Lord, both by faith and by sight, for all eternity, as he makes us more and more into the image of Christ. And I think that's a comforting thing to say, that, you know, all the things that we long for, as humans, in ascribing worth to things, we're heading towards a time where we're ultimately satisfied because we're ascribing the utmost worth to the greatest possible being.
Yeah, I think, and this may be way too much of a tangent, and I may be trying to connect too many ideas here. But I was thinking about in Revelation 22 this morning, where it talks about how, I'm not going to try and quote it because I that would go very poorly for me, but it's the part where it talks about how there won't be a need for light because God himself is going to light the city, because he's just going to take up so much of it. I'm thinking then about the connection to Genesis, right?
Yeah.
And how that is God in the garden, right? Like the goal of creation has always been a city.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about how, like, we kind of had a professor in college who would talk about how when he was young, he thought of heaven as this place where, like, you're floating on a cloud with a harp all the time. And he was like, that sounds terrible. I don't want to go to that heaven. He's like, I don't want to go to heaven. Why would I want to do that?
Oh,
but when you
man.
look at the biblical vision
Yeah.
of what it is, new creation is nothing but exactly what is in Genesis.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
except carried out to its fullest conclusion.
Right.
Which is, you know, God tells them, cultivate this garden, which essentially is him telling them, build a city.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
build a city for my glory.
Yeah.
And then to connect that to the Tower of Babel.
Right.
The problem with the Tower of Babel isn't that they were building a tower.
Yeah.
That had nothing to do with it. It was
Yeah.
the fact that it was for their own glory. They're going
Yeah.
to make a name for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so just thinking about that within the context of what it means that we are made to worship.
Yeah.
It's like God created Eden
Yeah.
and created man that they would worship him, that they would glorify him and enjoy him. And that's exactly where we're going.
Right.
And so we're not headed into some unknown, weird, ethereal cloud world, like the Star Wars cloud world.
Yeah.
We're headed into a city
Yeah.
that is exactly as it was designed at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there is this element of relationship in worship.
Yeah. Totally.
That is God coming to be with us, his presence being with us.
Yeah.
Because in the fullest new creation world, he's everywhere, because we don't need we don't need a light, because he's there, and he himself is going to light the city.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I was just thinking about that, like the connection of what it means for us, not only in the original creation to be made to worship, but also in the new creation.
Yeah, yeah, especially in the new creation. And you know what that does to especially the Christian life, it is like, you want to talk about it, the Puritans talked about this all the time. So much of the hope of the Puritan was, you know, in a world where death is so prevalent, you stare it in the face all the time, where opposition is staring you in the face. Something that they took so seriously was worship. You know, maybe even sometimes a little far, but like I think some of that ends up being a caricature of Puritans. But their goal was not, as one journalist wrote, that a Puritan is what was it? Somebody somewhere who is terrified of the thought of somebody being happy or something like that, or having a good time. Um, the Puritans had a serious joy and a serious satisfaction because of worship, and so the Christian life was building and anticipating more and more just that very thing of being in this resurrection, new creation city with the living God as we were intended to be. And it's that having that at the forefront of your mind, uh, and really, I think that alone, thinking of the work of Christ that He's done for you, how He's brought in new creation by conquering death and the grave, being united to Him, that now by faith you really do look upon the very face of God as He's looked upon you and united Himself to you via His Spirit. Um, that it's that really propels the Christian life in a pursuit of holiness, and it kind of works into every fabric of life. Of why am I going to be a good mechanic, a good Puritan mechanic, if you will? It's because I, by faith, behold the face of God and worship Him, and I'm doing now in shadow what I'll do in new creation in its fullness. And so that drives the Christian life. On that note of your professor who, um, talked about growing up, thought he thought of heaven as the kind of this ethereal existence on a cloud, babies and harps, very Tom and Jerry theology. And by the way, I love Tom and Jerry, so this is not a knock on Tom and Jerry. Um, I remember growing up. This is bad. Growing up, I was told somewhat in youth group, very well intentioned people told me this, but what is heaven? And the person that was kind of teaching that, and I quote, in my mind, and what I think of heaven will be like, it'll it'll be an eternal Christian rock concert. And I remember anytime that that would get said or something along those lines, or like an eternal Southern gospel concert, right? Like something like that. I would almost always want to cry. Because I'm like, man, I really love Jesus, but whew, that maybe I'm just not very holy. But the thought of having to listen to sorry if this is your jam, but it's just not mine. If you like listen to like DC talk for all eternity, I'm sorry, I'd just be
It's a tough beat.
I'd be sad.
It's
I'd
a
be
tough
really
beat.
sad. And so when I got a little older and I was able to really kind of follow the Bible, and as I read it, I'm looking at that going, wait a second, this new heavens, new earth thing is uh it seems a lot better than an eternal Christian rock concert or the perpetual Southern gospel.
It's so much more expansive
Yeah,
than obviously it's more expensive than what we can really comprehend.
totally.
But the vision that we're given, I think, is more comprehensive than a lot of Christians, faithful Christians,
Yeah.
really believe.
Yeah. And I think
Because
that's
it's easier to understand a world where we all float
yeah,
around and play harps,
absolutely.
and not one that says, not one that says, "Hey, you're still gonna work and you're still gonna
Yeah.
create and you're still gonna do things," but all of it is gonna be centered on worship
Yeah.
of the one true God.
Yeah,
And
without sin.
right,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
that's such a big deal, um and I do think that, there's a lot of talk about, people have a longing to be able to, take their Christian faith into every aspect of the Christian life, which is great. I'm glad people are thinking, how do I take my Christian faith? How do I take Sunday into Monday morning?
Hmm.
And in one sense, this is a broader sense. We'll talk about this more as we kind of go, because there are kind of various ways that you look at worship. Um, we'll narrow our scope more as the season goes, to where we'll look at why we do what we do on a Sunday morning and kind of break those down. But now in a broad sense, what we're looking at now, a very broad scope. What you do on Sunday prepares you for what you do on
Hmm.
Monday, if you understand what's going on. And if you understand where the Lord, uh, in redemptive history, is carrying you, as part of His church. It has everything to do with what Monday morning looks like. And but once we put handles on that, it really does affect everything. That this very broad, big picture, uh, that this life, we are bringing glory to God. We're able to make disciples with the vocations that He's called us to. Um, but again, these are, we're doing now in shadow. What we'll do in fullness in eternity is something that drives it. So,
Yep. And
you
it
know,
really is a glimpse into that new creation.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I'll say, I work the sound booth
mm,
a couple Sundays a month, and I, when I'm sitting up there and I hear everybody singing or
yeah,
responding, and I can see everyone, man, it's a
yeah.
glimpse into the new creation. I mean, this is exactly what it
It
is.
absolutely is. And it's kind of in that way that what we're doing in the grand scheme of things is pretty weird.
Yep.
Um, I was reading one of the mini books in preparation for this, um, and one of the authors said, there was a, basically a, a church growth guru at one point, that was basically like, part of the emergent church movement back in the early 2000s. If you don't know what that is, don't worry, you didn't miss much. But basically, one of his talking points was, the way to get non-believers to come to church, has to be in, like, you just meet at a coffee shop or a bar, but by all means, like, don't sing, because that's weird. It makes people uncomfortable. People don't want to sing unless they pay big money to go see Taylor Swift. Then they want to sing. But even then, it's kind of annoying, because you don't want to hear everybody else singing. You want to hear Taylor Swift sing. And so, what Christian worship really is, in so many different ways, is a subversive counterculture. Um, we're on a Sunday morning. This is why gathered worship is so vital. We're doing something very subversive. It's very simple, but it's deeply countercultural. Because we're saying we're going to gather together people who have literally nothing in common, like, by and large. Okay, I look I look around Zion, um, Church, and there are some people like me, with kind of mutual interests and backgrounds, and you know most everybody in there speaks English, and southeastern English at that. So there is a lot of connection there, but by and large, um, we probably wouldn't have hung out at school or whatever. And yet, what are we doing? It's in that moment that Christians really are saying, um, God is supernaturally meeting with His people here now, and something otherworldly is occurring in this place. Um, and you it may not have any sort of emotional reaction to that at all. It probably doesn't seem fancy. We've got uh, you know a bunch of people talking, and we've got some singing, and we have some moments where we sit quietly and uh, confess our sin to God, and that doesn't seem particularly supernatural. We take a little thimble of wine or grape juice and a little styrofoam type cracker, And somehow, some way, what we're saying with those simple means, what the Lord is doing is He's meeting with His people, and we're worshiping this divine being. And so it's so interesting, really, the structure of even the book of Romans, how Paul will begin in Romans 1 just talking about like the inclination of mankind, and he gets to go in and they worship the creature instead of the creator. Um, but what we're doing on a Sunday morning, and hopefully Christians are carrying with them into Monday morning, and will carry with them into eternity, it is really kind of the true meeting between God and man. I love the Australian, one of our dear Sydney Anglican friends, David Peterson. They're some of my favorite dudes in the world. I love those dudes. They're so cool with their accents and their Bibles, which they preach really well. David Peterson, in his book Engaging with God, he says this: the worship of the living and true God is essentially an engagement with Him on the terms that He proposes and in the way that He alone makes possible. So much of the, kind of the natural posture of the world is to say, I'm going to find satisfaction in me on my terms, and I get to declare who is God. And what Christian worship is subversive and countercultural. Is one, it pushes in and it says, yeah, how's that working for you?
Yeah.
It doesn't look like it's working out great. Two, you want true satisfaction and true joy. Behold, the creator and the sustainer of all things has promised with an unbreakable oath and an unchanging word that here, by these means, He's going to meet with His people, and He's going to transform you in very simple and subtle ways. Here and now, this is how the Lord is going to meet with His people. And so instead of approaching God or ascribing deity to whatever we decide, or choosing however we want to come before the Lord, with true Christian worship, we're really coming before the living and true God as He's called us to and promised us He would meet us. And it's just an awesome thing that from that, Paul then kind of builds his case somewhat climactically, and then in chapter 12, Romans 12:1, he said, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Or I actually prefer the way some of the Dutch prefer to translate it. This is your reasonable service of, this is actually what you're made for because of who God is and what God has done and who you are and what you've done and the person and work of Christ. Now, therefore, He whose ways are higher than our ways, and all things are to Him and for Him. Now, therefore, present yourself holy and blameless, acceptable, and render to Him what is truly Him, every facet of your life, before the very face of God, for His glory, worshiping Him. And that's a really encouraging word, to the mom who, is who is really struggling to find dignity in cleaning up unspeakable messes. This is your Christian reasonable service. You can clean up unspeakable messes, because your God meets with you, and your God has united Himself to you, and your God will bring you into a new creation, into the to the guy who is constantly slammed at work and hates his job, but has to do it anyway, and is on the cusp of breaking down and burning out, and being totally decimated to a pile of ash. It seems like, hey, that's hard. It shouldn't be that way, but your God meets with you week after week, day after day. He's united himself to you by the work of his Son. He's indwelt you now by his Spirit. And one day you will have perfectly satisfying, perfectly dignified work. And so you get to practice that now, even at a job that maybe you don't like. But maybe your boss is running you through the ringer, but you can still do your job to the glory of God. And kind of looking at life through that lens, through a lens of worship broadly, that really is a small picture, I think, of the Christian life and what should mark Christians as unique in society, and what we're called to render to the Lord as our chief end.
We talked about this when we got coffee the other day. I'm fascinated by people who try to provide sociological explanations for what it means to be a Christian,
Oh yeah.
because ultimately there isn't one,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's all these conversations. Well, they provide good, churches. The
Yeah.
the logic goes, people who go to church are generally happier, generally contribute more to society, generally, better parents, generally have, more kids, but what fill in the blank.
Yeah.
They're good for society.
Yeah.
But it never gets to the why. And the why is exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
That worship calls us outside of ourselves in a way that nothing else can.
Yeah.
Because we're ascribing worth to someone who is way bigger than we can understand,
Right.
who still loves us.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. So I'm excited for this journey.
Me too.
We've gotten somewhat of the why. Now we'll start to peer into the question of how and what. And I'm excited for that, because this is we get to dip our toe maybe into maybe some controversial things depending on what groups you run into, and but also just answering the general questions of, like, how is God actually meeting us here in this time and in this way? What's happening here? So I'm excited for it.
Yeah, we'll be back next week with another episode. We're going to experiment, and we'll have some special guests
Yes, we will.
later on this season that are going to be really exciting. So stick around.